Dinar shift. The screens are alight, the chatter is deafening, and a seismic shift is reverberating across global financial communities, fundamentally changing the narrative that has dominated niche investment conversations for years. What was once confined to the whispers of specialized forums, private Telegram channels, and deep-dive economic blogs has, in this hypothetical scenario, burst onto the main stage as a confirmed development, stunning both seasoned investors and mainstream analysts alike. We are witnessing, in this fictional storyline, the moment a long-held belief system achieves official governmental validation. This imagined confirmation centers on the formal acknowledgement, purportedly from the U.S. Treasury, of a dramatic revaluation event concerning the Iraqi Dinar IQD and the Vietnamese Dong VND. The fictional news as presented describes a hypothetical event that transcends the typical foreign exchange market fluctuations. It is framed as a strategic revaluation, a deliberate and organized correction of decades-long valuation disparities. For the long term, patient observers and fictional holders of these two currencies, this moment, within the story's context, signifies the triumphant conclusion of a marathon of geopolitical and economic observation. Yet, the story's implications reach far beyond individual fortunes. This development, if it were real, would reshape cross-border digital settlement integration, influence oil-backed monetary policies in developing nations, and signal massive structural shifts in global liquidity frameworks, all choreographed at the highest levels of international financial regulation. For more than a decade within this imagined world, theories surrounding a potential and dramatic revaluation of the dinar and the dong have persisted. Mainstream financial commentators consistently dismiss these notions, often citing a perceived lack of institutional backing or tangible evidence. These discussions were relegated to specialized investment groups, where geopolitical events, central bank maneuvers, and subtle monetary policy shifts were meticulously tracked. This steadfast community, according to the narrative, focused on the underlying economic realities of Iraq and Vietnam, arguing that their currencies were significantly suppressed relative to their national wealth and export potential. However, the fictional story suggests that the initial subtle indicators of this impending shift began to emerge as early as 2023. These signals included a marked increase in engagement between the International Monetary Fund (IMF) and the central banks of Iraq and Vietnam. Quiet yet decisive adjustments to regional monetary frameworks were also noted, alongside the development of new models for cross-border settlement flows, designed to bypass traditional established dollar corridors. These actions, initially subtle, hinted at a coordinated effort to prepare the necessary financial infrastructure for a significant valuation change, a change that would inevitably challenge the established global currency hierarchy. The storyline dramatically accelerates this momentum in the early part of 2025. This period is marked by initial, quiet updates to the SWIFT protocol involving the Iraqi banking system, quickly followed by broader cross-border settlement adjustments. These technical changes were described as clear, if unspoken, precursors to a major revaluation. The narrative paints a picture of intense, behind-the-scenes activity within the world's most critical financial institutions, where technological preparation was silently laying the foundation for a shift that the public would only learn about later. The focus was on ensuring that the global system could withstand and process the massive change in currency values. The true fictional turning point, however, is presented as occurring in December 2025. The catalyst is a leaked internal memo from the U.S. Treasury dated December 11th. This document was allegedly released by a fictional whistleblower, described as being part of a key compliance oversight team. The memo, within this imaginative context, outlined specific procedures for updating U.S. financial infrastructure to accommodate dramatically revised foreign currency values, explicitly naming both the Iraqi Dinar (IQD) and the Vietnamese Dong (VND) as the focus of these changes. This leak, though entirely fictional, served as the ultimate confirmation in the narrative. Following the alleged leak, the storyline describes a flurry of activity among banking insiders. Fictional reports surfaced indicating that the internal systems of major global banks, specifically referencing institutions like HSBC and Wells Fargo, had begun to display activated IQD USD and VND USD rate pairs. This activation within the internal systems of global finance houses, a transition from a non-tradable or restricted status to a clearly defined operational rate, was portrayed as the final technical confirmation. It marked the definitive shift from speculative rumor to an officially recognized integrated financial event within the story's framework. Ultimately, the fictional narrative culminates with the U.S. Treasury issuing a cross-agency directive that formally acknowledged the shift. This directive, in the story, served as the public, official recognition, completing the transition from mere market speculation to institutional fact. Naturally, the most pressing question for currency holders in this scenario revolves around the new post-revaluation figures. The narrative describes these updated currency values as truly extraordinary, representing a calculated and deliberate correction of decades of artificially suppressed valuations, as confirmed by fictional institutional data. Within this imagined storyline, the new rates are described in vivid detail, appearing inside internal rate verification systems used by major banks. For the Iraqi Dinar IQD, the fictional new rate is presented as $7.90 USD per 1 IQD. For the Vietnamese Dong VND, the fictional rate is $5.78 USD per 1 VND. These figures, while purely imaginative for the sake of the story, are portrayed as a direct and immediate restoration of value, moving the currencies to a level commensurate with their national resource backing and geopolitical significance within the narrative's context, entirely bypassing traditional market-driven currency fluctuations. The storyline frames this event not as a typical market movement, but as a strategic restoration of value, carefully overseen by international bodies and complex contract-level settlement systems. Due to the magnitude and structured nature of the shift, the story suggests that early access to these new rates was highly restricted. It was limited to Tier 1 banks, diplomatic accounts, and specialized private exchange appointments. Retail holders, the narrative explains, are expected to access the process later through phased compliance-controlled systems designed to manage the immense flow of exchanges methodically and securely across global jurisdictions. The fictional Treasury memo itself is presented as a remarkably detailed and operational document. It outlines XPLAY, CIT activation protocols, structural compliance frameworks, and the extensive interagency coordination necessary for a revaluation of this scale. The document, purportedly classified for domestic financial infrastructure, included specific schedules for secure redemption appointments and tiered access systems based on the volume of currency held. It also mentioned rigorous cybersecurity measures to protect the entire process from external interference or fraud, underscoring the severity of the event. Crucially, the memo within the fictional story is described as referencing a hypothetical piece of legislation, the U.S. Monetary Realignment Act of 2024. This fictional act, according to the narrative, established the foundational legal and financial groundwork necessary for asset-backed redemptions of the newly valued currencies. A key passage from the memo, highlighted in red within the storyline, dramatically stated that the revaluation would serve as a pivotal moment for strategic, economic harmonization, aligning suppressed currency values with national export capacities. The fictional message conveyed by the narrative is therefore clear. This was not a sudden, knee-jerk reaction, but a meticulously planned, organized, and executed event orchestrated with precision at the highest echelons of global financial authority. The underlying cause was the acknowledgement that, for decades, these two nations, Iraq, with vast proven oil reserves, and Vietnam, a rising manufacturing powerhouse, operated under currency valuations that simply did not reflect their actual economic strength, export capacity, or resource wealth. Beyond the immediate financial implications for currency holders, the storyline emphasizes the sweeping global consequences of this fictional revaluation. For decades, the global financial system has heavily favored dominant reserve currencies, often leading to the undervaluation of resource-rich emerging economies or nations recovering from conflict. This event, in the narrative's context, is a direct challenge to that long-standing financial hierarchy, ushering in what the story terms a rebalanced multipolar currency environment. The narrative suggests that nations aligned with the BRICS economic bloc, along with key energy exporting partners in the Middle East, had been quietly and significantly increasing their holdings of both IQD and VND. This preparation, within the fictional world, was driven by a strategic move toward diversification and a desire to shift away from financial systems centered purely on Western reserve currencies. This action positioned them to benefit immediately from the revaluation and accelerate the transition toward a more diverse global financial landscape. Furthermore, fictional commentary from the IMF within this timeline, purportedly dated December 2022, labels the revaluation as the most significant corrective recalibration of suppressed currencies in modern financial history. This framing, though fictional, strongly positions the event as a monumental and deliberate correction. It suggests that the revaluation also strategically benefits the U.S. by expanding global liquidity diversification, which could, in the long run, alleviate domestic money supply pressures and help stabilize the American financial system. The depth of this fictional shift is rooted in the economic histories of Iraq and Vietnam. Iraq has spent decades rebuilding its monetary system following conflict and sanctions, while Vietnam rapidly established itself as a manufacturing and supply chain hub for global industries, including electronics and textiles. Despite this growing influence and economic resilience, the narrative asserts that their currencies were intentionally suppressed as part of a long-standing strategy by international financial institutions to maintain global stability during their respective periods of rebuilding and recovery. Within this imaginative framework, the revaluation is therefore presented as a powerful symbol of recognition, an official acknowledgement that both Iraq and Vietnam have achieved sufficient economic strength, resource backing, and global cooperation to justify a full restoration of their currency's value. The event is portrayed as far from spontaneous. Rather, it is a calculated move, the result of years of international negotiations, the establishment of new trade alignment protocols, and methodical, quiet adjustments made behind closed doors by central financial authorities worldwide. A fictional bulletin from the IMF in December 2025 further underscores this sentiment, stating that the revaluation represents one of the most structurally important recalibrations of undervalued currencies. This implies a massive coordination effort across multiple global institutions, including the IMF, World Bank, and national central banks. The inclusion of Iraq and Vietnam in this emerging powerful geopolitical and economic network reframes the narrative, ensuring that these previously suppressed currencies finally achieve their long-awaited, coordinated recognition on the world stage. One of the defining features of this fictional scenario is the acceleration toward a truly multipolar economic environment. For years, global finance was dominated by currencies like the US dollar and the euro. The revaluation of the IQD and VND, however, serves as the tipping point that accelerates the transition to a multi-currency ecosystem. As the BRICS network expands and central banks increase their holdings of the newly valued currencies, the global reserve landscape begins to shift away from a unidirectional flow, distributing economic power more evenly. DLE Eastern energy producers, including Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar, are described as quietly accumulating positions in IQD and VND as a strategic hedge against Western monetary cycles within this fictional world. This global diversification and the rise of alternative financial centers significantly elevates the influence of Iraq and Vietnam in global trade, providing countries holding their currencies with new leverage in bilateral trade and exchange agreements, thus profoundly impacting the entire global economic structure. Surprisingly, the fictional narrative suggests that this revaluation does not destabilize U.S. monetary policy. Instead, the U.S. Treasury, having supposedly prepared for this shift through internal reforms and the fictional Monetary Realignment Act, sees a benefit. The revaluation, in the story, alleviates pressure on the U.S. to constantly expand its money supply to support international liquidity. As other currencies rise and nations diversify, the global economy becomes less reliant on the dollar as the sole stabilizing pillar. This fictional distribution of financial responsibility, rather than weakening the dollar, is portrayed as an opportunity for the U.S. to stabilize domestic inflation, recalibrate interest rates more strategically, and reduce long-term debt exposure. By cooperating with the revaluation, the U.S. effectively supports a more balanced global marketplace. The narrative frames this as a long-overdue development that provides the U.S. with an opportunity for domestic financial stabilization in the face of a changing global order. Moving from the confirmation phase to preparation is the next crucial step in this fictional universe. The confirmation, though thrilling, is presented as only the start. Currency holders are now faced with the critical task of disciplined, informed, and strategic management to ensure that this opportunity translates into long-term prosperity. The fictional Treasury confirmation initiates a sequence of events designed to guide holders safely through the redemption process, with the first and most critical phase focusing on authentication. The storyline emphasizes that Treasury-approved verification tools must be utilized to ensure the legitimacy of all IQD and VND notes. These procedures include checking for ultraviolet security threads, embedded watermarks, microprint analysis, and modernized QR tag verification, all of which are essential for redemption eligibility. The narrative stresses that counterfeit detection is a high-priority national security concern and notes that proper authentication could trigger serious legal complications and financial confiscation, underlining the need for caution and authorized channels. Following authentication, the narrative shifts to official redemption scheduling. Holders in this fictional world must contact Tier 1 banks, specifically naming institutions like JP Morgan, Wells Fargo, and HSBC, that have been authorized by the fictional Treasury to process large exchanges. These banks are described as operating specialized redemption departments staffed by trained compliance officers and forensic currency analysts. The use of third-party intermediaries or unauthorized brokers is strongly discouraged as they pose a significant risk to both personal safety and asset protection. Redemption appointments in the fictional scenario require stringent documentation, including government-issued identification, an assigned currency acquisition affidavit, and financial history documentation for large holdings, along with additional compliance checks. For high-volume exchanges, the storyline even introduces the possibility of non-disclosure agreements, NDAs, tied to privileged contract rates. Violating these NDAs, the NAR, ADIV warns, could incur severe penalties, reinforcing the high-stakes, controlled nature of the entire process. Before signing any binding agreements, the storyline strongly recommends that holders consult legal counsel specializing in financial compliance and asset restructuring. While the immediate excitement of the redemption dominates discussion, the narrative quickly pivots to the deeper, more consequential element, long-term wealth planning. Sudden wealth, if mismanaged, can evaporate quickly. Therefore, a strategic framework is presented as essential for building generational stability. The required framework in the fictional story includes comprehensive tax planning, the formation of trusts for inheritance stability, and careful asset diversification across both conservative and growth-oriented instruments. The narrative stresses that generational wealth is not built by a single windfall event, but by the structured and disciplined management that follows it. Many fictional examples are cited where individuals lost their sudden wealth due to a lack of guidance, while others who built solid frameworks became generational anchors of stability. The closing phase of this fictional news story emphasizes that this revaluation is more than a major financial development, it is a generational turning point. The rise of the IQD and VND from suppressed status to globally recognized currencies reshapes not only national economies, but the psychology of investors worldwide. For years, holders faced skepticism and ridicule, but in this fictional scenario, their persistence and geopolitical observation are now validated by official recognition and global acknowledgement. This final shift from speculation to structured reality transforms ordinary currency holders into active participants in a historic financial transition. However, the narrative sternly reminds viewers that with validation comes responsibility. The choices made in the immediate aftermath of this fictional confirmation will, in the story's context, determine whether this opportunity leads to a generational blessing or a fleeting moment lost to poor planning. Discipline, caution, lawful participation, and strategic financial guidance are repeatedly stressed as essential for navigating this unprecedented time. Dinar Shift maintains that this entire narrative is presented solely for educational, informational, and hypothetical purposes only. It does not represent real-world financial predictions, investment advice, or confirmation of any actual economic events. Currency values, monetary policies, and government actions are subject to unpredictable legal, geopolitical, and economic factors. Viewers must always consult with licensed financial planners, attorneys, and tax specialists before making any real-world currency-related decisions. Nothing in this program constitutes investment advice or guarantees of profit.